It's Dr. Tennant's Verbal Highs. Let's start the show with Lewis Tennant. Here we go. Guests and interviews that you're looking for with creators, innovators, and so much more. For all episodes and further info, verbalhighs.com is the place to go.
Alrighty, welcome to Dr. Tennant's Verbal Highs, a podcast podcasted weekly from a kitchen bench in Kingsland, Auckland, New Zealand. I am Sid Dr. Tennant, and I am the host of the show, and I think we're up to about episode 42 this week. I'll get to my guest in a second, one Scott Blanks. If you're going, who? Well, if you've ever enjoyed any part of New Zealand comedy, specifically stand-up, but in a wider sense, comedians in New Zealand in general, 9.9 times out of 10, Scott was probably a part of their story somewhere along the line. I'll get to him in a second. Recording this intro on my birthday. You have two minds once you get to certain numbers. 41 today, which coincided. Well, not coincided, it was actually yesterday that I saw my hair, the word hair came up in my planner, which means that it's been a month since I last attended to my hair with a third party, a haircut, and it kind of freaked me out how quickly a month rolls around these days. You know, the quickening, you've all heard of that. So only 12 more haircuts, each of which rolls around very quickly until I'm 42. I got $20 in an envelope from my grandmother, which is nice. Can't help but wonder if, I had kids and so on and a family of my own by now, whether I'd still get the $20 in an envelope, which, don't get me wrong, is totally lovely. It's amazing. It's great. It's nice to hear from everyone. I've heard from a lot of people this morning. But a part of me goes, man, I'm still kind of a you kind of feel like a big 15-year-old a lot of the time when you don't have the conventional setup of a 41-year-old. Don't overthink things, I guess. Actually, thinking about having a significant other again. I don't actually really think about that much, but thinking about that topic, it's quite funny. My mother put some existential fear into me accidentally the other day. For the last few years, she's been saying, she talks about when I meet someone and when you meet someone, and more often than not prompted by me. And the last time round, completely innocently, I'm sure on her part, she kind of looked in the distance and went, I'm just not sure what's going to happen there. So here I am, 41. Let's talk about Scott. Well, Scott owns the classic comedy bar at the top of Queen Street. It's been there since 1997. He's a kind of behind-the-scenes fellow. Why did he choose to come on the podcast? I think because it's been 20 years this year since the bar started, and it's still going. So he's probably thought this is a great time to sort of bring some of his story out into the public eye. And I was honoured, because when he left, I sort of thought, people have said to me, your podcast is important, and it seems sort of quite a lofty word. Your podcast is important. And they all have been important in their own ways in terms of archiving people's stories and the stories of scenes and the stories of, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, Scott really made me think that, because I thought, here's a guy who doesn't really put a lot of what he's done on the record. And through Brendan Lovegrove, thanks Brendan, when I said, I need some more guests, and suggested him, and Scott said, yeah, I'll come along. We don't know each other from Scott or Lewis. Anyway, I thought, this guy's given me an 80-minute history of stand-up comedy in New Zealand. So not only his history and the bar's history, stand-up comedy. I don't think there'll be another record this long put down. So I'm really grateful, Scott. And it was really interesting hearing about the sort of ins and outs of the comedy scene, a lot more than I was privy to as a general audience member before this. Scott mentions that the stand-up comedy scene's very sort of supportive, a tightly knit together network of individuals, all with ultimately the same outcome in mind. So if you are new to this podcast owing to being a part of that circle or being really, particularly interested in New Zealand stand-up comedy, can I just do a wee bit of self-promo and tell you that if you back through the episodes, you'll find one with Di Hemwood and one with Brendan Lovegrove, 2 episodes I'm particularly proud of. So wrap your ears around them, okay? Up to nearly 5 minutes now. You don't want your rant at the beginning to go too long. You'll lose people. Incidentally, I think there's a book. There's a book in Scott's story. Scott, I don't know if you're a writer. I'd imagine you would be. If you ever get time, I think you should write a book, or perhaps someone else should. Interesting thing with the comedy, the classic comedy bar is it owes its inception to the changing masturbatory habits of humans. So you can ponder what happened in the late 90s that changed that and how it happened. And how does that relate to the comedy bar, the classic? Well, you have to find out in the episode. Okay? Do like the podcast, please, if you haven't already, on the social media. I'll get to those in a second. I mentioned a couple of episodes in the past few. I've mentioned sort of fundraising for next year's internet subscription, which I pointed out I could afford, but just more of a sort of a gesture of support, as I don't really get any remuneration or anything for these. Not that I set out for that, but I just thought it'd be a nice sort of sense of community if I got to what it costs to renew my Squarespace subscription. Oh, I shouldn't have said their name. That's a free plug. They can bloody pay for the rest. Anyway, there's a donate button on the page. I think I mentioned in the past episode I nearly got there, but I realised that I was looking at a US dollar amount with my Kiwi dollar donations. But I've been very grateful for the Kiwi dollar donations. I'm actually about half of the way there. Anyway, to the socials, Verbal Highs Podcast on Facebook, at Verbal Highs on Twitter. Please rate and subscribe to the show on iTunes. If you want to get in touch with me, verbalhighs@gmail.com. Scott, sir, you were a scholar and a gentleman.
This is Dr. Tannen's Verbal Highs. That was the thing. When I saw Marin last, he was desperate. He was at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and he wasn't being liked.
And would this be, based on the fact that I've got to know him through his podcast, would this be 2007-ish?
Yes.
I think the podcast saved his life.
Yes. That he was a very bitter and twisted man.
Yeah.
And he was doing a double act with a guy called Kirk Fox.
Triple divorcee, I think.
Yeah. And Kirk Fox was dating or had dated Clint Eastwood's daughter, and there was a great comedy thread in that. Going around to pick up your. Pick up a girl for a date, and
Dirty Harry.
Please, Dirty Harry's your father, yeah. And but Mark and him were doing this double act, half an hour each, and he was so bitter, and the Edinburgh audiences just thought he was so up himself, because he was sort of an American going, I don't even know why I'm here. Why do people come to this shithole? And you're going. Yeah. This is the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, Mark. It's a bit of an institution.
Yeah.
It's a shithole. The food's crap, and people are, no one finds me funny. And
I'm lucky I found him after all of that. But to his credit, he's put that all out there. Part of his podcast is, oh man, I was an asshole.
And I have heard that from industry sources that success, which is what he craved. He so much wanted to be the celebrity. He craved. Success he's now found, and therefore has mellowed accordingly. So, yeah. And
then there's do you have sugar?
No thanks. No.
And then there's Rogan, whose stand-up I think's not my cup of tea at all.
No,
it's kind of bro comedy. But I listen to his podcast regularly, and it's downloaded at numbers that any of the major US networks would fall over for. It's downloaded millions and millions of times a week around the world.
In America, if you are a sort of comedian that appeals, for instance, to the truckers.
Yeah.
Imagine a long haul in America, where podcasts are king, probably on the long haul.
Yeah.
And you've got trucker comedy, and you appeal to the people who eat at diners, and you've got a massive market in the United States. That massive Midwest unwashed. I don't think Rogan would be particularly a favourite with, say, New York.
You'd be surprised he's downloaded globally hugely. He has people with PhDs in biochemistry on one week, and then he has martial arts fighters on the
he's
next week.
clever. He's
and then he...
yeah.
No, you've got his core to begin with, but he's an inquisitive guy, and so he really sort of effortlessly floats through all these different worlds.
Yeah.
So I like how he can talk to all those different...
Well, one thing about...
By the way, are you a little bit of milk guy or a big bit of milk guy?
A little bit of milk guy. I thing about that comedians. My wife, when I met her, had no background in entertainment or comedy at all, and of course she met the comedians, and she said, "My God, they're some of the most sort of well-informed, thinking kind of people she'd ever met." She said that comedy sounds so lightweight, and yet these people seem to be quite well-informed. And it was the interesting thing about that was it's a quote I heard the other day from a young comedian. Comedy, it's both the most important thing in the world and the most irrelevant thing in the world.
Yeah.
And you go, yeah, and that sums up comedians. They do a job that's probably considered one of the lightest weight jobs in the world. Like, you call that a job.
But hang on to what your wife spoke of earlier on. I've thought about this. They are, you talk about all these values that we adhere to, like freedom of speech and so on. They're the ones out there actually doing it. They're the unfiltered ones. They're the ones that can take whatever perspective they want on the world, and they do. They're the ones driven to do that. Yeah. Hey, this is going to be a great podcast because I only just got your coffee there, and we've just...
I know, sorry.
We're chatting already. No, it's good. It's good. I think the criteria is you also have to be a raconteur, so I think you'll be fine.
Oh dear, yeah, you'll be editing. Will be the hard part.
Well, I'll tell you that before we go on as well. Unless I completely lose my train of thought, or you phone me back and go, you know what I said about blah blah blah. Can you take that out? Yeah. The idea is that they are a conversation, man. Right. So maybe 30 seconds will get chopped out if that. I'll introduce you.
Yep, cool.
Great to meet you, by the way. My guest today has been described as the godfather of New Zealand comedy. I'm sure you've seen that line thrown around in the press a number of times. In 1997, he started New Zealand's first, and I think probably still only, full-time stand-up comedy venue.
Yeah. I wasn't the only one that started it, though. We need to keep... I always like make that very clear.
This is why we do this.
Yeah.
It was called, and it still is called, The Classic. It was in the shell of an old pornographic film theatre at the top of Queen Street in Auckland here. The Classic is still going strong, and that's why Scott's come out from behind the big black curtain. and after 20 years, that's a mess. Look, I've got to say, I was thinking about the spaces that occupies. That's hospitality and performance. So to occupy those two industries for 20 years,
yes,
kia ora.
In the same place. In the same place.
My guest's name is Scott Blanks. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
You live. Did you say you live up the road? You live near here. You walked.
I drove up here. But I'm just down the road.
Down the road. So the best place to start is where it started, right? Mm-hmm. So how did this all start? Are you from a family of funny people, or at least people with a good sense of humour?
Funny enough, I sometimes think of little influences in my life that pop up, and I thought of fresh ones this morning, which I'll touch on. But if I was going chronologically, I would probably start from sort of around about 8, 9, 10 years of age. One of the first records I ever owned was Fred Dagg's Greatest Hits.
Yeah.
So it was nice to start with a New Zealand influence. I wasn't aware of live comedy or performance comedy before I saw him do his parodies on the news, which is what he used to do, those little short 2-3 minute items, which were sort of like
kind of rural farming pieces.
So I saw those, and of course I loved the song. If it weren't for your gumboots, where would you be? That was probably one of the first comedy songs I might have listened to, other than the ones I heard on the Sunday request session. So I bought that album, and that was New Zealand comedy.
Yeah.
I also quickly discovered Monty Python by the time I was about 12.
Yeah.
And I had 5 Monty Python albums in a very short space of time.
And like me, did you have a bunch of arguably slightly nerdy friends who'd recite the parrot sketch verbatim?
I think you can tick all those boxes with people who like Monty Python.
Yeah.
So we used to know all the sketches, and is this the right room for an argument?
So how old are you? Do you mind me asking?
How old am I now?
Yeah.
I almost couldn't remember this morning. I was 58. I'm 58 now.
Oh, 58, right, because that's because I always try and place my where I'm placed in the sort of New Zealand and global, pop culture, whatever it is, with my guests. So definitely, I'm about to turn. I'm about to the same as you. How am I about to turn? I'm about to turn 41. But certainly, Python was still a big thing.
Well,
amongst the drams.
I suppose I was 10 in '69. So my teenage years were the 70s.
And so even in New Zealand's sort of sparse television environment, were they playing Monty Python quite early on? Because I was going to cap off what I was going to say. Aside from all of that, my big TV thing, comedy-wise and politically-wise, and what spoke to me for when I grew up was The Young Ones, which I discovered, for an uncle at about 8 or whatever. And, I didn't get all the jokes, but I've since watched it and I get all the other jokes.
Well,
now.
that was the next generation.
Yeah.
Monty Python were a sketch group.
Yeah.
So they weren't stand-up comedians. They had some solo characters, but it was sketch. And it was naughty. I mean, when I got to watch the first series of Monty Python on TV, it was late at night here.
When was it showing here? How early on?
I can't remember when it kicked off, but I know it was a little bit controversial at the time because there were naked breasts on their show. And for comic effect, of course.
Yeah.
But that must have brought another audience.
Yeah.
And so as a young teenage boy, I was watching it for the comedy, as like we read Playboy for the articles.
Yeah.
But you just happen to get a little bonus with Monty Python every so often. And that was the sort of sketch influence. I was always a big fan of sketch, but I then discovered in my 20s, I had this sort of the comedy revolution where I discovered something completely new. And I was working at the time for a company called Kerajodian Film Distributors.
Yep.
And I was involved in the marketing and release of The Secret Policeman's Ball. And
Was that big charity?
Big charity movie. It was,
Yeah.
it was a charity show made into a movie. And in the movie was Monty Python. But it was also the first time you saw Rowan Atkinson.
Yeah.
It was Billy Connolly was on there,
Yeah.
Alexi Sale.
Yeah.
And then they made Monty Python. Then they had Secret Policeman's Ball 2,
Yeah.
which is where you saw Rick Mayall. And that's where I got introduced to the Young Ones.
Yeah.
And I became aware that they were part of a new revolution that was going on at the Comedy Store in London.
Yeah.
A changing of the guard.
And where are we roughly now, Ty?
Well, we would be
early 80s.
This would have been in the late 70s.
Yeah.
Probably coming into the early 80s. Yes.
Oh
Yeah,
wow!
yeah.
So you're talking about that film coming out. I was thinking, well, what about VCRs? But they didn't really hit New Zealand, and comedy tapes in the store wasn't.
No,
until
this was
early mid 80s.
This was a time when there was a definite big gap between the release of a film and the release of the video. I think there might have been video about.
Yeah.
But still, this was in the cinemas. This was when the film was released. So I did the marketing for the film, and I got to watch it a number of times. So I got that sort of exposure to the comedy over and over. You got to see the tricks and you saw it was Monty Python meets these new young kids.
Yeah.
Also, the changing of the guard was like when Alexi Sale and the Young Ones took over the Comedy Store. It was moving on from Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. It was moving on from Les Dawson and the sort of working men's club kind of comedian.
Yeah.
Who still had a job, but they weren't part of that cool front line.
You went to sort of from smoke-filled RSAs to sort of inner city venues, and Alexi was really political and angry. I've seen sort of footage of him secondhand on YouTube as the compere and stuff, and he's outrageous.
And I've just finished reading the book of I'm Dying Up Here, which was what the TV series was based on. And it is the story of the sort of setting up of the Comedy Store in LA, which also is legendary. There was, and it covers the strike that was there when performers went on strike to get paid something, because you didn't get paid when you performed there. But the people, this covers the arrival of Jay Leno, David Letterman, and of course also Richard Pryor was the sort of god of LA comedy.
Wow, I just realised something. So I think you're saying to me that analogous to sort of these stories we know about punk rock and whatever, pre-internet and what have you, we've got in the States and in England the kind of same thing happening.
The revolution.
Right.
It's a revolution in comedy. There was revolutions. Punk was a revolution in music.
Yeah.
And so along came these new wave of comedians replacing the old school. Richard Pryor was the sort of king of the LA comedy scene.
Yeah.
And of course he released his movie. the Richard Pryor Live,
Yeah.
which I also saw and was like, wow, you can say these things on stage.
Yeah.
Followed up quickly by Eddie Murphy.
Yeah,
you can say these things.
Which
on
was
stage.
the first tape I saw, because, being a kid, I knew, I kind of knew stand-up, but I knew Eddie Murphy because he was such a huge cinematic draw in the 80s. With 48 Hours and Beverly Hills Cop and da-da-da-da. So here he was on this cover in the video store up the road from me in this red leather suit.
Yeah.
But it was always a red 18 to get it out. I saw it before that, but yeah. So Secret Policeman's third ball, is it? Comes out.
First ball, the Secret Policeman's ball, and then Secret Policeman's other ball.
Got to get our balls lined
the
up.
Secret Policeman's other ball with the two films.
Right, okay. So you see that here in New Zealand. There just hasn't been stand-up on TV or whatever in the past. So this is just something you've not seen before. Don't even have the albums or whatever. Where does it go from here? And do you keep with Kerajodian or
early 80s? While I was still working in the film industry, I used to hang out at a nightclub in Auckland called Retro in the O'Connell Street. And the lovely gentleman ran that club, Graham J. Smith, and I'd have to credit him for potentially starting, without him even realising it, New Zealand's comedy revolution.
Yeah.
Because he held a comedy night in the nightclub on a Wednesday night when there wasn't many people about. So he had a comedy competition. And I used to hang out there and dance, and it was my home club. So I, of course, entered the competition. Along with my mates that I'd met at the club, one of who was a chap called William McGeechy.
But you'd seen the film by now. You got some reference. Good. Okay.
I'd seen the film. So we all, it was fun. A comedy night. You mean like the sort of stuff we've seen in those movies? So stuff we've heard about and read about, and so we there was a comedy competition, and in that comedy competition was me and my mate William McGeechy.
Yeah.
And his name changed at a later date to Willie DeWitt.
Yeah.
There was Ian Harcourt,
Yeah.
Dean Butler, Peter Murphy, and Chris Hegan, son of and a member of the famous Hegan family, hosted the comedy competition. And we all met in that competition, which ran for about 6 weeks or something. Willie won it, and his prize was a trip to Sydney to perform at the Sydney Comedy Store.
Big smoke.
Yeah, big smoke. But what did come out of that was I said, I suddenly had this vision of forming New Zealand's equivalent to Monty Python.
Yeah.
So I got those five together, and we formed a group called Funny Business.
Can I stop you there? Can I show you something?
Yeah. Yes, that's it. That's the album.
Yeah.
Yep.
I've just handed our guest a vinyl copy of the Funny Business album.
Yep.
You're looking at it with reverence, like you haven't seen it for a few decades.
I've seen it recently because I've also been digging in my archives, and we do have one of those in the archives. So
I think I learnt Norman the Mormon as one of my first ever guitar riffs.
I was there. I saw that performed live for the first time.
Never mind the alternative New Zealand national anthem. Sorry, go on.
And it's great. The alternative national anthem. I bought a lounge suite, which is a great music video. If you want to search YouTube for the Funny Business Lounge Suite song. And so we formed that group. And that was in around about 82, 83.
Wow, right. And where does it go from there? So you're already sort of you're taking on an organisational role because you weren't part of the performance group, were you? You were
I was the manager. Well, actually, when we entered that competition at Retro, I sort of said to Willie, "Can I be your manager? I think it's very funny to enter a comedy competition with a manager, like a rookie competition,
like kind of wrestling, superstars of wrestling."
So where I did used to wear flying suits, so I thought I sort of looked the part. I was acting as manager, and I continued that role. I was the sixth member of Funny Business. I took care of all the marketing, promo. I got my mate on the door, Steve, to take the tickets. I ran the sound and lights for the show. I set up everything. So they would walk in, they had to rehearse. We used to have proper rehearsals, maybe a couple of times a week.
Good.
Like, I don't see many people doing that.
I'm sure the Python people did too.
My
immediate question that comes out of after everything you've set up is, to put it blunt, how the fuck do you convince people to give you shows? Because what you're doing is like, you're doing a what? With a what?
It wasn't difficult because, of course, there were lots of rock venues around Auckland they were often full Friday and Saturday night.
Yeah.
I'm talking particularly of the Windsor Castle in Parnell.
Yeah.
Now, the Windsor Castle in Parnell had a full PA that was set up by Live Sound. It was there permanently.
Yeah.
So we approached the Windsor Castle. They had a great manager there who was really like, we all knew him, and he said, "Can we do a comedy night at your bar?" And he went, "Okay, how about Wednesday night?" And I went,
Perfect.
I might have to kick you out occasionally for a band, but you can have Wednesdays.
Yeah.
And Live Sounds, who were really supportive, said, hey, look, you can have our rig. You don't have to pay a rental on it. It's there anyway. So we had this massive rock and roll rig for full band as our PA.
I love that story of everyone going, yeah, we're into it. I thought it might have been like typical.
No, well, I mean...
People like to laugh,
God,
right?
The name of the guy at the Windsor Castle's on the tip of my tongue, going back. But he said, well, let's see what happens. Well, we did a bloody good job.
Yeah.
We used to get sometimes over 100 people in the Windsor Castle. And
Yeah.
he said, I don't get 100 people here for a band on a Wednesday night.
Yeah.
Sometimes
You're selling beer for him on a Wednesday night?
Sometimes it would get a roll on and we'd get maybe near 200. And it was like, wow, for comedy.
So again, pre-internet, da-da-da-da-da-da, posters and flyers, or however you did it, how did you, because this is this organisational role you've forged the last 20 years, 20 plus years, how'd you get, where'd you get 200 people? What, unis or posters around town?
Well, you see, because I worked for Kerajodian, I was in charge of marketing at Kerajodian, so it was really easy to moonlight a little bit and call in favours. So I would go to a radio station, hey, I've got this movie premiere, it's the next big thing from Arnold Schwarzenegger. But also, I've got a comedy show next Wednesday, so can we just sort of somehow get a little bit of a mention in from a comedy show and you can have the premiere of Terminator in New Zealand? Now I'm saying that on radio. There's going to be people out there, maybe some who are still alive, who work at Kerajodian and go, whoa, he was tricky.
I've got the scoop. Hasn't the Kerridge been dead for years?
That's pretty defunct now.
No, I mean the actual person.
Yes. But that's what honestly, I took advantage of my connections and my leverage from the movie.
And so again, I keep banging on. Although probably a lot of my listeners are of a similar certain vintage, but you've got to remember a mention on the radio then was probably a lot more deep impact than a mention on the radio now.
Kevin Black would mention us on Hauraki's breakfast show in the morning. Do you know how many people listen to Kevin Black?
Back then, absolutely.
In fact, I had very close contacts with all the radio. So a lot of the people who are now have run New Zealand radio, back when we were doing this, were like the Midnight to Dawn jocks, or the Drive jocks, or they were just the jocks working the station. So they've all moved on to much bigger and better jobs. But back then, they used to come to the shows. Some of them would get up and do a spot even.
Willie ended up on
Willie
radio,
and Dean both ended up on Hauraki's breakfast.
Yeah.
Years later.
So I'm trying to think about Funny Business. So I think they were a late 80s thing for me, because the album and the television show.
Yeah. That happened after we had been going probably 4 years before that happened. In fact, funnily enough, I sort of stepped back. When they got into TV, I had other things to do. I was...
Well, that was going to be my next question, is it seemed like bubbling up. What happened with them? Why didn't Funny Business sort of continue?
They sort of went their separate ways after 3 TV series and a bit of touring. I don't think it was still what you call a financial success.
Yeah.
So I think the focus of some of the members changed a little bit.
Yeah.
Peter Murphy went off. He worked for the DSIR. He had a proper job, and he went off down country and started working. Ian Harcourt moved to Wellington.
Well, with my story with Ian is I had a brief dalliance with what Ian ended up doing in Wellington, because for a spell there in my uni years, I was doing improv murder mysteries with him.
Right.
We were characters in these sort of corporate,
Because he was part of the launch of the Improvisers.
Yeah,
in
that's who I was working with. Yeah,
Ian was in Wellington. That left Willie and Dean up here. Now, what happened?
Tim didn't like me. I'll just put that on the record. Tim. Ian was fine.
Oh, who Tim?
Tim's the guy that started the Improvisers.
Yeah,
ex-priest from St. Pat's.
Oh,
so good words are spoken about him. Anyway, God, how do we get there?
Yeah,
continue.
So after Funny Business sort of broke up, along came this little group of young bucks from, we call them the Manawatu Comedy Mafia.
Yeah.
They're actually, I think they were out of Taranaki, somewhere down there.
John Bridges.
All out of Massey University. They'd all been at university together. They had been part of the University Comedy Club.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, at one stage...
I'm guessing we're at mid-90s here?
No, not. We're in very much still the end of 80s,
beginning
of around 1990.
Sorry, I'm a stickler for dates.
Funny Business toured once to Massey University on an orientation tour. These guys saw Funny Business on stage during that tour and were influenced by them and started their own group at the Massey University. You're talking Paul Horan, Dave Downs, John Bridges,
Wow.
And and after they graduated, they pretty much all moved en masse to Auckland.
Yeah.
Along with Jeremy Corbett, who came up here, and Nigel Corbett. So we had the Corbett brothers, and we had the old group called Facial DBX, who were, if anyone knows comedy history, they'll know a TV series called Away Laughing.
Yeah.
And a lot of the Facial DBX members appeared in that series.
Well, when uni had a strong orientation to it, when I was at uni, Facial DBX were definitely a thing to go to.
Yeah, well, they were the comedy clubs of the universities were a great breeding ground for comedy, and Facial DBX were the prime example of that.
And you had a hand, like with Funny Business, in being the behind-the-scenes little black book, pull the strings, book the venue guy, didn't you?
Well, the Facial DBX sort of joined up with Willie and Dean when they all moved to Auckland. So we had Willie and Dean from Funny Business. We had the guys from Facial DBX, Jeremy Corbett, Nigel Corbett. We had the core of a new group, and Willie and Dean said to the guys, "Hey, look, we're doing these shows at Kitty O'Brien's every 6 weeks. We need to up the ante, and we know someone who might be able to help us up the ante." So Willie came and found me and said, "I've got to introduce you to these other guys. We're thinking of forming a sort of a super group. And would you like to do the same job again?"
Yeah.
And they very kindly invited me in to become, again, the non-performing group of about a dozen comedians. And we started Comedy Fest at Kitty O'Brien's Tavern.
When was that?
That was in about 91, 92.
And what did that involve? Because I've done a little bit of prodding around on the internet, and I do believe that's a pretty important time and place to mention. Yeah,
yeah. That was the absolute beginning of what I call the current revolution, because what that was a gig every Thursday at Kitty O'Brien's, and once a month on a Wednesday for Rookies Night.
Yeah.
So we began to lay the foundations of what is the current program of New Zealand comedy in New Zealand, and at the Classic. And so you had Thursday Pro Night and Rookies Night once a month on Wednesday.
Is that weekly timetable still stuck wherever it's...
Pro Night still goes 25 years later, every Thursday.
Rookie Night's Monday now. For
Rookie's
you guys,
Monday.
isn't it?
What happened, we did that at Kitty O'Brien's. We then went, hey, we've got something here.
Yeah.
Because what everyone learnt was that you can repeat your material.
Yeah.
They didn't realise that, they used to go away and spend 6 weeks writing a new show. Oh, and I go, no. Firstly, we're going to go weekly, and you can repeat your material.
Yeah.
And we'll rotate the performers so it's not the same lineup every week.
Because from a performance point of view, the way I see it, it's a delicate balancing act there, but you're actually honing your craft, and if you're repeating your material, aren't you honing your craft as a performer?
Well, you are, and also the audience helps you hone it, because it's their reaction. You go, I'm going to accentuate that. I might take that out. That's not really working with the audience. You can only do that by repetitive performances.
Yeah.
I
was just thinking, what sort of a pool of people have we got here in 91? Because I'm thinking it mustn't have been a far shot from going from amateur night to pro night. Well, there's 16 of you. 4 of you are doing pro night. We need to move more people onto the pro lineup.
Well, that was a thing about everyone going, oh God, we're going to need some more comedians, which is why we started Rookies Night, because we knew we had rookies floating around, and we couldn't put them on our pro stage. There were people we couldn't pay because we didn't think they had deserved it yet. But the journey was short. As Brendan Lovegrove used to say, if you did a good gig on Rookies Night, you were probably on Pro Night the next week.
Right, so echoing my sentiments.
Now, that did happen. And then we just expanded. We realised we had something that other venues could want. So we went to the Masonic Tavern in Devonport on Saturday nights.
Yeah.
And that was a real important one, because that was a Saturday night. Saturday night audiences.
Wow, Saturday for comedy.
Saturday for comedy, because the Masonic had bands on Friday, but we used to take over the upstairs room at the Masonic on Saturday.
Yeah.
We easily get 200 people in there. People came from Hamilton and Whangarei to see the show.
Wow.
I can remember people saying, I've driven all the way up from Hamilton. I go, well, thank goodness you've made that journey, but I'm glad you didn't expect a seat. They actually had rung ahead and said, we're coming, can we get seats?
Yeah.
Because we were turning people away.
So this is getting early to mid-90s. Yeah. On the Rookie Night, because, I'm sure now the idea of turning up to an open mic night it's in the culture. It's in the culture. So where were these people turning up from? Who were they?
Mad, crazy people.
Did you see some shitters?
Sugar and Spice, the crazy duo Sugar and Spice. Jack Tweedy, Brendan Lovegrove, Tay Radar.
But I'm meaning more the sort of turn up and then forgotten and blessed them for doing it. You know, what were these people from all walks of life, all vocations?
Oh, well, we had a lot of crazy old dudes who had probably always fancied themselves as working men's club comedians. Getting up.
Oh no!
One guy.
I'm Les.
There was one, I can remember one in particular. I think he used to do a bit of poetry too.
Yeah.
He used to get up on stage with his bulldog, and his bulldog would sit next to him, and while he was performing. And I think the bulldog sometimes used to get a little excited when he was performing. I can't remember now. I think some people have a better memory of that. So we had all walks of life. There was definitely, and it was pretty easy. Kitty O'Brien's was a very easy venue.
What do you get, a minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
I think we've always been around the 5 minute mark.
5 minutes?
Yeah,
which probably seems, before you go to do it, extraordinarily achievable, but I'd imagine it could be the longest time on earth once you're up on the stage.
It can be very painful.
Because 5 minutes of spoken material to entertain people, that's quite something.
Yeah.
And then, so it sounds, well, it doesn't sound like it's plainly evident that you're sort of trying to push things forward
yeah.
With all of these projects. We're maybe going to make a bit of a leap unless there's anything else you want to speak about there. But so kind of roughly what happens between the early mid-90s before we end up at the top of Queen Street in 98? Just more building all these standalone shows?
Building. The one thing that probably changed the business was doing gigs on Fridays and Saturdays made us realise we've got something that people want all week. Not just once in the middle of the week. And also the Comedy Festival came along, and once a year we became a major part of the annual Comedy Festival. We started bringing international acts to New Zealand who we had met overseas, or some of us had gone to the Edinburgh Fringe.
I'll tell you a distinct memory of that, and I've seen a lot of different styles of art forms performed a lot of different ways in a lot of different places, but this just stands out as, oh my God, that was amazing. Because I think I was doing a radio show at the time, so the luxury was terrible pay, but tickets to great stuff. Mm-hmm. So I went to the James Cabaret in Wellington to see this fellow who I'd not heard of before, who had a grand piano set up on the stage, and just proceeded to blow my mind with musical comedy and anecdotes. It was Bill Bailey.
Bill Bailey, yes. Well, he was one of our first.
Yeah. Can you please clarify that memory for me? Because sometimes our memories get all mixed up. He did request it. There was a grand piano in the ride, or wasn't there?
I think it was a electric.
Okay, there was a piano, though, wasn't there?
Electric grand piano.
Because musical comedy is so gash in the hands of the wrong people. Yeah. But I distinctly remember that. Would that be...
He was
I'm going to guess 95, 96?
95. He was a game changer. 94, we bought Alan Davies here.
Yeah.
He was our first big Brit comedian.
Yeah.
He also, a lot of people thought, wow, this is different. This was a different style of stand-up. This was a more contemporary British stand-up.
Yeah.
So Alan Davies came in 94. He came back in 95 with Bill Bailey and Rich Hall.
So someone like Bailey, because I've since become a real fan, he didn't have anything like Black Books back then or anything. So was he big in the kind of mainstream Britain?
No, he had come out of a duo called the Rubber Bandits.
Yeah.
And he had gone solo.
Yeah.
And this was he'd only just gone solo. He'd done, I think, an Edinburgh Fringe.
So he was known in alternative comedy circles in the UK.
He was not big at all. He might have been a little bit older.
Yeah.
But he was, we'd gone to the Edinburgh Fringe. We'd done a bit of scouting. And so we went, oh, great, we've found this guy. It's this amazing act. This is not stand-up even. And our goal,
sit down.
Our goal was to bring international comedians that would influence our local comedy scene.
Right.
Not just dotting the I's and crossing the T's of stand-up. Yeah. Comedians that people would go, oh, this is something different. We can, thinking outside the square, which immediately starts to attract new people to the comedy scene who are not stereotypical, which is what we were trying to do, is bring more talent.
Right, so it's a win-win. Audiences are entertained, their horizons are broadened, but at the same time you're sort of nurturing and tutoring the locals here as well.
Had you ever seen Rich Hall before? Have you heard of Rich Hall?
I know Rich Hall,
Well, he came here in the same year as Bill. What a team.
What a team.
Bill, Alan and Rich Hall all here at the same time.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful year. They all performed at the Watershed Theatre.
And was there a feeling of, like, I think when...
feeling of revolution.
I feel like when music artists come through like that, and suddenly everyone in that scene is really vitalised for a period afterwards. Did that sort of happen with all the local performers and stuff afterwards? It was
always revitalised after the festival. Yeah. And also it taught us... it was turn-away business. We were at the Watershed Theatre. Yeah. We were packing them in. I mean, there was some serious money being made now, and we were going, oh, this is business. This is bigger business.
Yeah.
And we had to pay the performers. But then they were really happy. They said, God, the results you get in your city... considering we're not big names, is incredible. And Alan Davies just said, what a great festival. I remember him coming here, and he came from Melbourne.
Yeah.
And he got off the plane, and he was grumpy as, and he said, I've just had a shitty time in Melbourne. And and the very bright and smiley Paul Horan and myself met him at the airport, showed him around. He said that's chalk and cheese, the difference between the New Zealand International Comedy Festival and Melbourne.
I would have said to him, you don't understand. Nothing's happened like this since we landed here in the mid-1800s.
We did a thing.
This is the first time.
The difference is that when they went to other festivals, it was business. When they came here, it was hospitality.
Yeah.
They said the performing was a joy, the audiences were a joy, but it was the offstage, the camaraderie amongst the industry. They said it felt so old school and sort of like a little community.
It's really interesting to me because around that period I was quite ensconced in the music scene, and similar thing with artists that hadn't toured before coming through, similar level of notoriety, talent, everything you talked about, everything you just mentioned is transferable to music. They all said that same sort of thing around that time about coming to New Zealand. And a lot of them, I remember a couple of instances of having, less than favourable experiences in Australia. But I guess we were just up for it because, like I joked about, it was like kind of a bit of a cultural revolution in a way, all this stuff starting to happen then.
Yeah, well, hospitality, I think, is in our veins. We surprisingly, we don't realise what a hospitable nation we are. And it was the boys and girls of Comedy Fest had been brought up right and knew how to take care of guests, and also knew how to throw a party, which was another important part of the festival. Great parties.
So some good hedonism as well.
Yeah,
nice
so that was the revolution. We suddenly felt the power of the sold-out shows in the festival. And then the year after that, we brought Alan Davies back and put him at Sky City Theatre.
Yeah.
And Sky City Theatre had only been open a couple of years,
Yeah.
and their programming was a disaster.
Yeah.
Nothing they programmed in there was succeeding because they were doing it in-house.
They're just worried about blackjack.
Yeah, we turned up and went, well, we wouldn't mind putting a British comedian in there, maybe for five nights. And they went, it's a big season. And we went, well, we'll give it a crack.
Yeah.
Completely sold out. Alan Davies,
Wow.
big bickies, there's lots of money in that one. And you're going, now this is really it. We're now promoting international comedians in the big arenas. So.
Hey, you keep saying we. I'm wondering whether that's a humility thing on your part. It's sounding like you were the sort of entrepreneurial, organisational spirit behind this. Or was there a sort of a company or a collective of you?
Yeah, the Comedy Fest was the collective. And it was all those people I mentioned earlier on when we started at Kitty O'Brien's. And what we were at the stage, we were now at 1995. And we went, do you know what? I think we need our own venue. This is like a collective, what are we going to do next?
Yeah.
Well, people were starting to get real jobs. Most of them had graduated from university and had and careers underway. And they're going, we're going to have to do something because we can't.
And you're like, I'm not going back to my old life.
I'm not going back, no. So we actually said, you know what, we need our own venue. And there were some designated tasks, and I've been thinking about that recently. And we had Show Me the Money man, Dave Downs. He was chairman of our board. We had a board.
You got that? Hang on, let's rephrase it. Dave, Show Me the Money Downs.
Dave, Show Me the Money Downs. We had Evan Build-It Blackman, and he was going to use his skills as project manager to build this new place. We had me. I was Scott Fillet Blanks, Fillet Man. They call it. My job was to try and fill the place with punters.
Fill in the blanks?
Yeah, fill in the blanks.
Scott fill in blanks.
I had two jobs: fill the stage with performers, fill the auditorium with audience.
Yeah.
And we had Mr. Schmooze, Paul Horan, who was a fantastic schmoozer.
Now, how do I know that name? Was he a performer as well?
Well, he was part of Facial DBX.
Right, of course. Yeah. Where's he these days?
He's in Melbourne. Sydney, Melbourne.
Still a performer?
He's very much involved in the entertainment industry and television production, and also a bit of a guru when it comes to comedy on TV over there. So, and even over here, he gets brought back here as a consultant for comedy on television here as well. Yeah.
What do you think of comedy on TV over here these days? I mean, it's really hard to get anything on local television these days.
Well, you say
Except
that.
For Charnui ads, but
we've got 7 days now into its 8th, 9th series.
Great show, yep.
And that's been a major part of it.
I'm a fan of a good panel show.
Funny Girls, just shooting its 3rd series right now.
Yep.
And of course, we've had, when we opened just before we opened the classic, Pulp Comedy, the TV show, was launched. And that ran for 8 series.
Wow.
And that was also a very important show for putting New Zealand comedians, albeit late night, in front of New Zealand audiences.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, New Zealand audiences were seeing not just half a dozen comedians, they were seeing 3 different comedians every week for 13 weeks.
Well, 7 days, I've thought about it, it's fairly obvious, I mentioned it anyway, but just to get your take on it, that's got to be the room filler for everyone on those panels.
Yeah.
that's your
Well, isn't it funny? I mean, panel comedy.
that's your province's shows filled up.
Panel comedy had been around for a while, but along came a bunch of guys called the Download Concept, who had been trying the panel idea out in a number of different versions.
John Bridges was involved with it.
And John was brought on board as the founding sort of director of the show.
Yeah.
And that was really important because suddenly they put a person in charge of the panels who was very much a comedy man as opposed to a TV man.
Right, gotcha.
And he filled those panels with comedians,
Wow.
people he knew already were funny.
Yeah.
And what he said is, we don't need other people. We want comedians. We don't need.
What did they want to put on, like sports stars?
Yeah, they go. Well, we don't think we should have just comedians. You're relying so much just on these people, and they're not. We don't know them. How about a few household names from sport and news and other TV shows? No. Put together a bunch of comedians.
Yeah.
If you've ever sat in the green room at the Classic, and not many people get a chance to, it's the funniest place in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Because it's a giant panel comedy show.
Yeah.
And it is. No, if you could record the green room at the Classic, you would have the funniest TV show in the
I
world.
really like. I do like a good panel show, and I binged a few years ago. In fact, I was really busy with something else in my life, so I somehow ended up just watching in many episodes instead of doing that. But the British music-based one. Is it Nevermind the Buzzcocks?
Yes.
Have you seen that?
Yeah, well, of course,
Great
Sean
show.
Hughes just passed away last week.
Really?
Yeah, and Sean Hughes was one of the founding panel leaders on that show. And he passed away from cirrhosis of the liver and other complications last week.
Lifestyle stuff,
but
right?
boy, that was a game changer over in the UK.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, because the... it made Sean Hughes much that he sort of resented it a little bit because it wasn't quite the what he wanted to be known for.
Yeah.
But he did get known for that, as did other people on that show,
Yeah, they
and
did.
they made their careers.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of comedians realise, you can make a career out of the right show, and you're right.
Well, not only a career, you're in a gig-based lifestyle. That's your bread and butter for the week. Mm-hmm. So you can relax. I don't mean relax like pull back on the motivation, but you're not freaking out about the income thing as well. Surely that's got to be a great luxury.
Yeah,
landing one of those shows.
Then you get this massive following of people who are following you for the wrong reason. They're not coming for your stand-up comedy. They're coming to see you off the TV show.
It's the man from the telly.
Yeah, they expect you to be like the man from the telly, and that mightn't quite be the comedian's act. You know that, of course, Steve Martin suffered from that in the US because he got so famous he had to play auditorium. He had to play baseball parks and things, stadiums. He went to stadium comedy. He just didn't want to.
No.
He said, this is not my thing.
Well, that whole on-stage, off-stage thing can really torture people, the whole introverted, extroverted thing, which I think a lot of stand-up comics are. I think that's a really interesting mix of, introvert and extrovert. Pryor's another one. Pryor, apparently on film sets and stuff, was just completely different to his persona on stage. Polite, quiet, sort of standoffish.
Well, that is, of course, comedians, they have that phrase in comedy about he's on or she's on.
Yeah.
Which means when they're on, doesn't mean they're on stage. It means they've turned on the comedy. Comedy juices, and when you're off stage, comedians, many of them like to turn that off.
Yeah.
But of course, your punters hanging out don't want that to happen.
Yeah. Oh, I'm saying it's not even to turn it off. I think for some of them, it's more that they're a little bit reserved or shy whenever they're off stage. Throw a burning hot spotlight on someone, and you are gonna.
Well, you don't have to be. You don't have to be a raving exhibitionist to be a comedian. They're very introverted people are comedians, and I've
contemplative types.
Contemplative. I've had a lot of international acts here, and of course, they're not people I necessarily know.
Yeah,
they're at the end of the phone initially, and
but the type.
I know their act. I don't know
right,
them,
yeah.
so it's always interesting when you're meeting them for the first time. I pick them up from the airport.
Yeah.
The drive-in from the airport is one of the most important drives.
Totally.
Important time I have with a comedian because it's the first time they've met me in person sometimes if I haven't met them in Edinburgh, and so I drive them in from the airport.
Could you walk me through your technique, please?
Well, I just talk to them.
There's jet lag.
You've got the jet lag to take into account. They're vulnerable.
Yeah.
But I don't. It's nothing terribly insightful. But that first conversation tells you what sort of person they are. What their reaction was to coming the flight, the long flight. What their reaction to customs, their reaction to looking at Auckland for the first time. Whether they're whether their eyes are open and they're looking, or whether
Yeah.
they just shut down and
Yeah.
like, just get me to a bed so I can
Yeah.
sleep.
And a lot of that, too, often it's not a testament to their long-term personality. It's maybe how just ground down they are by the touring circuit at the time and all that sort of stuff as well, right?
Yeah, I always hope that when they come to our festival that we're a bit of a breath of fresh air, maybe after, particularly if someone's feeling a bit jaded. And Stuart Lee is the very, very best example of this.
Yeah.
The great Stuart Lee from the UK had just had the shittiest time working with his Jerry Springer, the opera musical. He got so much flack from the right wing. He couldn't walk out his door without getting criticised by someone. So he hated being home.
New Zealand, perfect.
And funny enough, I came along just at the right time and said, "Would Stuart like to come to New Zealand?" He said, "I'd love to get out of here."
Yeah.
So Stuart turned up, and he had the best time of his life here. For one thing, he found real groovy. And man, he went and secondhand bookshops.
Yeah.
He had to buy extra suitcases when he went home to fill with records and books. I hate to think what his baggage allowance extra charge was.
So expensive per
But
kilo.
Stuart actually wrote about us in the book, going that two of his favourite venues in the world are the Stand in Edinburgh and the Classic in New Zealand.
That's pretty high praise.
Yeah.
I want to move back to the venue opening up, but it's something because we revived an old conversation. You're talking about books before, bios you'd read, and Pryor's come up twice. There's a really good bio about Pryor that I've read that I should actually read again. Might be called Pryor Convictions.
Yeah.
It's a quick read, but it's a real insight into just the madness off stage and so on. But I remember really enjoying it.
It's really interesting reading about the reaction that he got in LA at the Comedy Store because he supported the strike too, which was they needed that. They needed people of that stature.
Yeah.
But also his career was sort of made outside that sort of TV environment because his comedy was too strong for TV.
Oh, just the depths of his addiction in the book.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
It's a strange thing to be a claim to fame, but he's a crack pioneer. Basically, it was very uncommon to smoke coke, and he ended up in out of it. Psychosis, delirium, pouring himself head to toe in cognac while freebasing and lit himself on fire.
Yeah, well, I saw him live post that period.
Really? Was that when they were wheeling him on stage when he was in that sort of?
Yep,
Was it sort of tragic or amazing or
it
both?
was incredibly tragic. I'll tell you, I went to the Comedy Store in LA not knowing who I was going to see. I just turned up and I'll see who's on tonight. I got there and there was a bit of a buzz about the place, and then I got my seat, I got my 2-drink minimum, and then we heard that Richard Pryor was going to be on. And I was aware of the background. I was going, Richard Pryor, what sort of state's he going to be in?
He had MS at the end, didn't he?
MS, everything going on. Well, he was carried on stage by two big boys.
Yeah.
I tell you what, then they stood around the room. If anyone got up to leave, you would have been crucified. So it was like being in prison, being imprisoned in comedy. It wasn't funny. It was painful.
Oh God! So he went from being like the Muhammad Ali of comedy to
I saw Richard Pryor, but I didn't see the Richard Pryor. Man. I saw a very, very a pale version of it at the end, and I hated that experience. I didn't want to see someone like that. And also, the show was hosted by Paulie Shaw, who was arguably the worst stand-up comedian in the world.
So back to 97 in New Zealand, Jim Bolger's in power. I think Chains by Shea Fu was probably single of the year. Yeah. There was a massacre in Rarimu. Probably that's about it for New Zealand in 1997. Except that you back to opening this theatre.
Yeah.
How do you find the space? You just eagle eye it?
No, from my years in the cinema industry, I knew the Classic. It was the Classic Cinema when I was a younger man. I went and watched West Side Story there once. Yeah. It became the adult cinema because the lovely manager Jan Grefstedt couldn't get prints of the old classic films anymore because of video. Yeah. They all got taken off the circuit. So he could only get video, and really the only video people wanted to come and see was porn video. Yeah. Because this was pre-internet. So he ran the adult cinema, and
so he came from the mainstream film.
Yeah, he also ran the Avondale, the Hollywood and Avondale, and then that was
we do art house in Avondale, and we do stick films in Queen Street.
And so I knew of the space, and I always knew from travelling that nightclubs and cinemas, good nightclubs often were made out of old churches and cinemas. Yeah. So I started poking around with the other guys in our troupe, and we found out that that the lease was a very loose lease with the council.
Yeah.
And Les Mills was mayor at the time, so we approached the council and said, you've got a porn cinema as one of your tenants, and I don't know what else is what other things are going on in that building, because there are 4 floors. There are people living in it. They're not supposed to be people living in it. So we sort of pointed all this out and said, look, we can really raise the moral high ground of that venue, of that building, by putting a comedy club in there. And the property people at council said, yeah, that's a good idea. So unfortunately, they gave Jan his marching orders. And we took over the
Does Jan know that you,
he's passed
behind
on.
the scenes,
yes, he
organised
did.
his
He
execution?
hated me. He didn't like me and didn't like us for what we did.
I was just thinking I wasn't going to say, that's a pretty cutthroat move, but hey, good on you.
Well, at this stage...
20 years later, let's just get, okay, that's not good.
But come on, the internet was there. The adult cinema was going down quickly because the internet had arrived, and so he had no choice. He couldn't make the bills pay anymore. And he wasn't even paying a proper rent, whereas we actually offered rent.
So you get the keys,
the keys.
You get in there, and I'd hate to imagine the state of how long had it been a pornographic theatre?
Oh, 7-8 years.
Right,
yeah.
So, bucket of paint.
A lot of look. We had proper builders. We did the proper. We gutted it. We saved some bits that were useful. We gutted the place. We didn't have a big budget. Never have had a.
So
big
where
budget.
the stages now is where the screen used to be.
Yes. Yeah.
Go
So there are a lot of things are in the same place. The toilets are in the same place. We built a green room on top of the toilet, so that's how the performers hang out in this room with a very low ceiling.
Cool.
And access, but the comedy room, the venue has wonderful proportions for a comedy venue. Really nice.
Because you'd already done recce's to like Comedy Store in New York and LA and.
Well, the club is based loosely on the Improv in Hollywood. And simply,
that's the one I was thinking.
Simply put, that one had a front bar and a restaurant as well. We couldn't have a restaurant, but they had a front bar where the comedians hung out, and then you went down a short corridor into the showroom. So that division is very important to a dedicated comedy club because you've got the arrival and the anticipation. And the doors open, show into a seat like a theatre, and sit in that seat. And now you're in a room, and you're only in that room for comedy. You're not there to talk about what's happened during the day. If you want to do that stuff, we can move you out to the front bar. You can continue the conversation.
So over the 20 years, how does that work? Do comedians do crowd work to get idiots out, or do you have staff members going, "Shut up"?
Comedians don't have to do anything to find idiots. Idiots announce themselves.
So you're in there. You've based it. You've based it on that space. You get it up and running.
And we transfer our program that I was talking about earlier. We go, great. We've got Thursday covered. That's our pro night because we closed down Kitty O'Brien's comedy and we closed down Masonic comedy, any other comedy we were doing. And we said, right, I think at this stage we were already doing every Wednesday, Thursday and Saturday when we were at Kitty's. Sorry, Masonic on Saturday. So we had 3 nights of the week covered. So what we did is we opened up Friday night. And we made Wednesday was stopped being Rookies Night and became Fresh Comedy Night, where pros came along and tried out new material and they weren't paid. Thursday they got paid pro night. Friday, Saturday we did the early show, and we very quickly introduced late shows because we realised that like the comedy clubs overseas, you can have an early and a late show.
And so that's established New Zealand comedians or internationals as well? Whatever was around.
That's pretty much what... And then we needed a Rookies Night, so we started up Mondays, and Monday became Rookies Night. And Monday is Rookies Night at the Comedy Store in LA. I think it also might be Rookies Night in London at the Comedy Store. But we were open very soon. We were open 5 nights a week. There were not many comedy clubs anywhere else in the world other than the couple of main clubs in LA, a couple of main clubs in London. Maybe.
I didn't know that.
We were open more nights than the Sydney Comedy Store was.
Wow. I'm not going to assume that's due to numbers. There was demand there.
No, there was wishful thinking by the people who had opened the club going, we've got to open more often, guys. We need to turn over some...
So it wasn't like Uncle Scrooge rolling down his big tidal wave of coins straight away?
Oh, no. I must admit, we were optimistic with our Monday Raw nights. Some never happened. You go, sorry guys, we've only got 4 audience members.
We don't have a quorum.
No. At one stage, we moved the Raw nights from the venue into the front bar. Thought, let's just do it in the smaller room at the front. And we tried that. We tried all sorts of things.
So you're kind of saying it was touch and go for the first 2 years?
For 2 or 3 years, it was some very good festivals and then some slim times in between. We were having to we had what we call our slow patches. There were too many of them.
Yeah.
The slow patches were like September, October.
The one that went from 99 to 2001.
Sort of around about January, February.
Yeah.
God, there was some financial crashes. There was stuff going on like that, which mucked up the
Surely
business.
comedy's recession-proof. On the bean counting front, I was just thinking about that as well. So how many of you were bluntly financially invested in it when you started it on up?
Well, there were 21 shareholders.
21. Okay, so no one had like a life-changingly large amount of money riding on it. Yeah.
No one did. What happened is that
I think that's probably ultimately a good thing.
We had
man,
a budget
because
to
I reckon someone would have got cold feet earlier on if someone's next decade or whatever had depended on that investment.
I tell you what, we had a budget of about $250,000 to refurb and open.
Yeah.
We had 21 shareholders
Yeah.
who were family and friends who had to find hard cash.
Just over 10 grand each.
They had to find cold hard cash.
Yeah.
Some people found more than others.
Yeah.
I think we managed to assemble about $150,000 in cold hard cash.
Yeah. Well
we were
done.
short $100,000.
Yeah.
We opened with a debt of about $100,000.
Wow.
We carried that debt for about 3 years.
Okay, so I take everything back. That sounds really stressful. That is a really large amount of money.
Yeah, we carried that debt for 3 years, trying to finance it and trying to pay it back, pay it off.
Yeah.
We had some very accommodating creditors.
Yeah.
We had a nice bank manager.
Yeah.
But their patience wore thin. At the end of 3 years, we voluntarily liquidated, and all those shareholders lost their money.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Okay, that changes everything I just said, because that's quite a bit of money each back then.
Yeah, well, it wasn't. Some of us, I was around about that. Some had put in like 20, 25,000 who had a bit more resources.
So was it sort of like Lewis does the hand signal folks of the fork in the road?
Yeah.
Was it like, for you, I go the way of everyone who's lost their money, or I try and salvage this? You obviously took the right hand side of the fork. How does one do that after that glorious ending?
It was around Christmas. It was leading up towards the end, after the festival of 2000, I think.
Yeah.
And I can remember. I just had this memory a couple of days ago. I was at home. We'd all had this conversation amongst ourselves. The responsible members of the team said, we cannot continue trading and responsibly. We have debt and we can't pay that debt. And I think we may have called a meeting of the industry to explain this to all the comedians and the industry and our stakeholders. We had to have those difficult meetings. We explained what was going on. I don't think we knew exactly what we were going to do next. I remember being at home one night with U2 on far louder than it should have been,
right,
with a bottle of whiskey or something like that.
Say a bottle of scotch.
On my own, raving around the house.
Yeah. Pressure valve, man. You've got to release that tap for a bit.
It was quite a night. I remember. I put on an accountancy hat, which I hadn't worn since I was 19 years old, because I was an accountant auditor for 3 years.
Yeah.
And I started to think of some financial restructuring, as the others did too. So our bank manager put us in touch with a voluntary liquidator who was very, very good at these things. He sat us down, did the numbers, and said, right, you've all got to give up your shares, lose that. Right, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to sell all the assets of the Classic to a trust.
Okay.
And you're going to set up this trust.
Yeah.
And
so all this is sort of Cantonese to me, all this financial
I know.
dealings. But
we identified.
Does that happen because you were a limited that's that limited liability thing, isn't it?
We were a partnership up until that stage.
Okay.
I think.
Let's not get too lost in the minutiae.
Not get lost in that. But we realised that there were two sides to the business. There was a very nice hospitality unit called the Classic, which filled the place with punters and sold drinks to them, and it was like a theatre to hire venue. The problem was making the comedy pay for itself. So I said, I'll take over the comedy production side of it.
Yeah.
And we set up a trust to run the Classic, which included some of our old founding members. I wasn't part of that trust.
Yeah.
They ran the trust.
Yeah.
I ran a company called comedy.co.nz Productions. I took over all the production of comedy. One-man band. Back to the days like a funny business. Just me on my own doing all that.
I think that might be you in your element, though.
Yeah, but I just did that, and I continued to do that for 3 years. And then we turned around, we had actually settled up with everyone.
Yeah.
The guys said, right, We now have the Classic in safe hands. You've got a living out of production of comedy, and I said, I will buy the trust. I will buy the assets of the trust and start a new company called the Classic 2001 Limited.
Yeah.
And to this day, there are two companies, Classic 2001 Limited,
Yeah.
Comedy.co.nz Productions. We still separate the risk of producing comedy from the hospitality unit of the Classic.
Well done. I think that Whiskey and You night was good because that could have just spread out over months if it hadn't have been.
It was a very collaborative process,
exercise.
and you know what it required? It required some fantastic largesse from those original shareholders.
Well, I've felt this come across from you throughout the podcast is that you've had there's been, to your credit and probably a bit of luck and whatever around good people who see what you and your team are trying to do.
Yeah, that's the thing. Ultimately, when you go, wow, the city deserves a comedy club.
I hope you're giving the bank manager comps. Come along to Tuesday night.
Yeah,
here's a bottle service.
Yeah.
Bottle service.
Maybe a few complimentary nights for the IRD.
Yeah. And I sort of heard, well, again, a little bit of research I did before you came over, that you're sort of quite notorious for you were really hands-on for many years, weren't you? You went to most nights, is that right?
I slept there sometimes.
Yeah.
I lived there. I saw every gig. I sold the tickets.
For how many years?
From that point I took over completely around 2001. I took over the Classic, around 2001 through to about 2010, 2009.
If I can pry into the psychological aspects of that, was it control freakery because you had a lot riding on it? Was it a desire to see as much of what was going through the club as possible? Was it a little bit of column A and column B?
It's more about a case of if I could contribute my hands in there, that was one less person I had to pay on the night.
Right.
So I would front of house.
Yeah.
So I would sell the tickets, and that way I met the audience too. Very important to meet the audience, not just the comedians.
Yeah.
So I got to know my audience as well. I sold the tickets. I then went in and watched the show. I used to tech the shows occasionally because that's what I also used to do. That was fun. I mean, you got to know all aspects of the business.
Yeah.
I very much am, as I describe myself on the Facebook page, the maintenance man. Because if something goes wrong,
Schneider, you're the Schneider of.
Yeah,
why do they call you the Godfather? We should call you from here on. Let's call you the Schneider of New Zealand comedy.
I can poke around with a spanner and a screwdriver and do amateur DIY all the time. Look, I tell you what, my current staff hate it, I think. Because they go, why can't we just get professionals in to do this?
You say, if only you knew.
Yeah.
Hey, I want to touch on just the art of comedy and stuff.
Right.
And I haven't look how long we've got left, but I had just thinking today a question I wanted to ask you because it comes back to what I said very much in the intro about, well done for 20 years in both hospitality and performance, avenues in Auckland. What do you think about Auckland in general? I'm thinking around those areas. What does it need? What does it do well? You've established something that just simply would not have been there if you hadn't have done it, I just think of the different cities I go and the things I like.
I do like the fact that part of the art scene in New Zealand is that still DIY.
Yeah.
That it hasn't been corporatised and taken over by well-meaning arts councils and because it's very easy to do that, but there are some things like live comedy which should never be corporatized. You've got to allow there to be a bit of anarchy and a bit of anti-establishment. It's important, and it's been said that if you look around the world, at healthy societies, most healthy societies have a comedy scene.
Yeah.
But you start thinking of some areas of the world where you've never heard of comedians from those countries, and you go, I can probably understand why, because they're not allowed to be that way.
Yeah.
I find it really interesting when you go to the Edinburgh Fringe and you do strike comedians from countries that you didn't imagine had a comedy scene.
What I found fascinating was this world of media saturation we live in. Speaking to what you said, there's a guy maybe called Joe Wong, who's this expat Chinese guy who lives in the States, who does really good stand-up comedy with a very strong Chinese accent. I was just thinking about countries where you don't, based on the way the society is, you don't expect a strong comedy scene. So you're saying in Auckland that we do what we do well, we do weller in New Zealand is because it's DIY, it's get on with it, it's don't let it be touched by grubby fingers.
Yeah. And also the benefit, and most people will say this too, is that for Auckland is having a dedicated quality club.
Yeah.
The environment is so important. To be a good comedian, you need a consistent quality environment.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if there's too many variables going on, how do you tell if you're getting better or worse?
Yeah.
If you're going, the audience tonight, I couldn't read them. The room was terrible. The lights weren't working. The PA didn't work. So, you've got to take all those out of the equation. We provide a really consistent quality environment. So comedians can come off stage and go, I was shit, wasn't I? And you go, yeah, you were shit. The audience out there is great.
When I listened to, I had Di on the podcast, and he was talking about when he was really green and just full of piss and vinegar and just trying to perform. And they'd book out, like RSAs in the provinces down near Wellington. And he said he does these nights where you think of the classic New Zealand sort of RSA bowling club or whatever, where the kitchen PA was going through his mic signal. So he'd be doing a stand-up and be like, number 74, steak and chips, come up and get your meal, love.
If it wasn't that, it was the taxis parked outside coming through the PA system. That was another one that would happen occasionally,
Talk about I want to talk about the craft, man.
Yeah.
Like as I say, you've seen a hell of a lot of comedy. What makes a good stand-up?
What makes a good stand-up? When they're starting out, got to have something to say, got to have a point of view.
Yeah.
Got to understand the simple structure of humour. Why do people laugh?
Okay, tell me about that.
Well, people laugh.
I feel like I'm sitting there to a guru now.
No, this is where I say to people, this is where comedy and magic are so similar, because a magician is doing something with his right hand, then reveals the trick in the left hand.
Yeah.
Comedy is so much similar in that you can't have the audience sitting there going, I know where this is going. I can see where this is going to end up. And yes, it ended up there.
Right.
And you go, that's not funny. The funny audiences laugh at the unexpected. If it's unexpected and real quality, they will applaud.
Yeah.
But that is why people laugh, is simple trick of going, I'm telling you about this. You're not going to expect what's coming up next, are you? The comedian knows they're not going to expect what's coming up next from experience. And when they do the reveal, audience laughs. And you can see, the better someone is at crafting their stories and whatever they're doing along those lines. That's why liner comedy is so simple to understand.
What do you mean liner comedy?
Where it's generally one single line. Punchline, one single line, punchline.
Like Mitch Hedberg?
Like Mitch Hedberg,
but
Stephen Wright.
He was a master of it.
Yeah, and Stephen Wright.
I thought you used a word I want to touch on, about what you just explained with the craft, and you said with experience. You said with experience you can magician analogy. Now, I've always, in any kind of performance or art form, been really interested in the natural who jumps up on stage first time cultural meme. And the Gladwell's 10,000 hours of doing something, the 10,000 hours.
Yes.
For the majority, is it putting the work in? Just speak around this. Have you seen people just jump up and you go, oh my God, they'll wear someone else's after 200 hours?
There are some people who have some natural advantages, but everyone with stage time will become a better comedian.
Yeah.
But not everyone is destined to become a great comedian.
Yeah.
Because there are two sides. There's the performance and there's the writing.
Yeah.
It's always in the writing.
Yeah.
If you can't write comedy,
Yeah.
then all you're really doing is invading the stage with some sort of crazy personality.
Yeah.
And you go, and eventually the audience will see through that. It wears thin. There has to be something to back it up. So sometimes we get rookie comedians who come up and I can look at them and go, wow, you are so confident and you look fantastic on stage.
Yeah.
I love the voice. I love what you're doing. The audience is engaged with you. You just need something to say now.
Yeah.
And then you get, and then you get other people at the other end of the spectrum who
Yeah.
get up and you go, oh, the writing there is beautiful. If I closed my eyes,
If I could just get a scrub and a bit of hot water and
some people end up being more writers than performers.
Yeah.
And we don't have a lot of stand-ups in New Zealand, if any, that buy comedy off writers.
Well, we don't even have. I mean, the whole writing thing is like that's right. If you can't get the performance side of comedy, you can have a career overseas and being a showrunner or whatever, can't you?
But I do see collaborative things happening in New Zealand comedy, like because I often say to comedians, buddy up when you're starting rookie raw comedy. Find some other people in your peer group that you like working with and buddy up with them and help each other out. So you often see comedians watching from our balcony, watching their mate on stage, and then they'll go backstage afterwards and collaborate.
Oh, I see. I thought you meant become a duo or whatever.
No, they just give each other feedback.
Yeah.
And also they can give each other, like sometimes very common is to see comedians come backstage. I love that bit you did. How about this for a tag?
Yeah.
And a tag is when you go, the comedian who wrote it might have got their own punchline, right?
Yeah.
So they've got their premise, they've got their punchline. Someone will come in and go, I've got a secondary punchline that you could tag it with. Because the art of great comedy is, you don't want to set up premise and then only have one laugh.
Yeah.
What you want is set up premise, laugh,
yeah.
oh, callback, laugh, oh, tag, another laugh. So you've got 3 big laughs off one setup.
I love this. Brendan came in and used that vernacular as well. I'm like, I've never heard this before, but I can hear it being played out.
So sometimes comedians will trade tags. You know. Sometimes comedians will go, look, I've written this great bit of comedy, but it's just not me.
What else I really like about what you said about that sage advice of pairing up or teaming up and kind of becoming a mentorship, is I'm thinking the very kind of nature of what stand-up is, as well as perhaps some of the personalities drawn to it. What you're actually doing there also is I think you're kind of in a way diffusing future competition and ego. You're setting people up as a collective rather than a bunch of new people starting out trying to kind of get one up over each other.
The New Zealand comedy scene is so supportive of each other.
Yeah.
That's another thing international comedians who have come here for the festival have said, I can't believe how much all you people get on. You're like a great big, slightly dysfunctional family. And I go, yep, that's pretty much what...
Like the Muppet Show. You're like the Muppet Show.
We are. That's exactly what the New Zealand comedy scene is like. And it's fantastic to have people like Di Henwood coming in. And he came in the other Monday and hosted Big Wednesday last week. And he came in and he didn't know half the acts. But, he sat in the green room. He got to know everyone. He had some tips.
So that's a big man in town show. Well, it's actually literally not a big man, but it's that for the new performers. That's,
we do that in October each year. I get people who are unlikely to host a Raw night to come and host a Raw night. So this month we had Jeremy Corbett, we had Michelle A'Court, we had Ursula Carlson and Di Henwood hosting Raw.
I've heard tales that Ursula was one that sort of jumped on stage and a few people were like, my God, has this woman been doing it for a while?
Yeah, I've got some...
sorry, to clarify that, everyone, I didn't finish it properly. That's a positive thing. I was meaning that I've heard feedback that good comedians thought she had been doing it longer when it was actually a workplace dear.
Yeah.
You should go and do stand-up comedy.
Yeah, from the moment I saw her on Raw, she came off stage after her first gig and was like buzzing. And I said, that's a really good first gig. We'll get you back to see if you can do it again. Because some people have one gig in them and then they go downhill. Others have an appalling first gig, learn heaps, come back a second time, much better. And so you've got to, I never judge people off one gig.
I bet you have occasionally.
I'll certainly spot someone like Ursula and go, I'm going to give her a second gig, give her a third gig, fourth gig, fifth gig. And we've had some people like that on Raw down the years.
So I'd love to dwell on the positive, but I do love a good train wreck story as well. And you have spent many an hour watching many a comedian and probably many a chancer and probably many a potential mental health issue as well.
Yeah.
Points in the club where you are like, oh my fucking God, we have to get this person off the stage. How does that work out?
Well, the worst one ever, we didn't have to get him off the stage. He exited himself, but in a very colourful fashion.
Oh, this is the setup.
Yeah, what happened is this young man turned up, quite a serious young man, quite focused. You can tell when they come in, they ask the manager and they go, what do I need to know? And there's not a lot of lightness to them.
Notes under the arm.
Notes book. And girlfriend in tow.
Yeah. Oh, I wasn't expecting that.
And he was a reasonably good looking chap. And he went in, he did we showed him around like we do with all the Raw comedians, showed them what needed to be shown and did all the things they do, sit in the green room, focus on their pad and pen and went on stage, but obviously had very high expectations about how this was going to go. So a few minutes into his set, things weren't going that well. I think a few people in the audience offered words of support. One of our regulars down the front must have said something, but he wasn't getting the laughs, or if he wasn't getting the laughs he expected to get, so he just stopped and he looked at the audience and I went, what's happening now? And then he just threw the microphone sideways into the brick wall of the Classic. And if you've ever heard a live mic
certainly have.
Head first into a brick wall. So that sound alerted everyone in the club, particularly the comedians in the green room, that something was not quite right. He stormed off the stage and pushed Zane over, who was sitting in the front row on Zane's chair, pushed Zane over, marched through the club. I was standing at the back of the room. He walked right past me with no acknowledgement and out the door. And I went, oh, right. I can't remember who was MC, but they came down the stairs and sort of put their head around the wings and went, where's he gone? And the microphone was on the ground with a very flat head. But it still worked. Credit to Shure microphones.
Yeah, those bloody SM57s.
Yeah, they picked it up and tapped it, went, hello?
Angry comedians, rock stars.
But the funny thing was that a couple of minutes went by before his girlfriend got up. And she came down and she went past and she just said quietly to me, I better go and see how he is. By this stage, he'd gone out the front.
I love the way that she waited till the heat was off.
And then But he'd gone. I followed him out. He went straight out the bar, straight out the front door, and off down the street. So I'm not quite sure where she was going to find him. But she went out. After
Something
him.
you said in that story, I was going to ask you about, is you said it wasn't quite going how he thought it would. And you guys talked about 81, 82. There was no expectation of how it would go or what people would think. Do you think stuff like the fact that there's Netflix specials dropping all the time now has really influenced your newer comedians coming through as well as their expectations?
There's no doubt. There's so much comedy now online to the point of you're drowning in it.
Well, the Netflix specials,
and all credit to the money that the comedians are earning for doing that. I suppose it'll eventually reach a sort of a saturation, and people say to me, aren't you worried about that? You're losing business, losing your audiences. And I say, well, I haven't seen any evidence of that yet.
Yeah.
And that is because no matter how much stand-up you watch on television or on screen, it is only 50% as funny as being there live.
Oh, sorry, I was more meaning, has it influenced performers' styles or their expectations?
Well, no,
or whatever?
because the thing is online, not just those Netflix specials. There's so much stand-up.
Yeah.
If you can go searching for all sorts of comedy. So if you're a bit of a weirdo and you go, well, I don't seem to fit in with all this stuff, I'm going to go and search
Emo Phillips.
Yeah, I'm going to go and Emo was in the Secret Policeman's Ball.
Yeah.
You can go and search alternative comedy. And you might find, you go, yeah, that's what I want to be, one of those.
Yeah.
And
so you don't get people coming in with sort of faux American accents or...
Yeah, we not just faux American.
I think that is well.
No, and faux original material is the other problem we have.
Yeah.
We had an example of that recently.
Well, I guess the internet makes joke thievery very easy.
Yeah, well, I'm not a great advocate of our comedians throwing their stand-up up online all the time.
Yeah.
I'd say don't film your sets at the Classic and throw them online because you've got no control over who sees that.
Oh, you just made me realise you could assemble a set together from quality, completely unknown comics from around the globe.
We have had
down to the Classic.
Yeah, we've had a couple of examples of that, but of course everyone can see that comedy online. So just recently, we had a young gentleman return from overseas, and he did a set, and it was the first set he'd ever done at the Classic. Opened very strongly with a bit, and another comedian sitting next to me in the green room heard a key word. In fact, heard one of the first words in the set from the green room. Went, his ears pricked up.
I've seen that on YouTube.
And he went out and watched it, and he came back, and by the
Bastard!
time... Yeah, but he came back with his phone
Yeah.
and called up and gave his phone to me, and I watched that set from the stage on the phone.
Wow.
As the guy was still on stage, still performing the second half of his set. And so
did he know.
we had to call him on that.
Did he apologise for being...
He just said,
that
oh,
is,
God.
If I was him, I would... That embarrassment can be the only emotion.
I didn't call him on it that night because
What
I wouldn't do that to anyone in the green
what
room.
a
I
tw-
emailed
what a
him the
tw-
following
what a-
week and
oh
said,
my
what's
God.
the story? And he just apologised. He said, I must have seen that somewhere. And
I must have seen it somewhere verbatim.
and remembered it. But and we've had examples in the past of
Because
people.
have you heard of Carlos Mencia in the States?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, he's notorious.
You know what? I also I lecture a little these days, and we use a program called Turnitin, which checks for plagiarism with essays.
Right.
So my next project, which will go gangbusters, is I'm going to invent an app-based plagiarism checker for stand-up comedy.
Yeah, music lyrics too, maybe. I don't know.
I think there's Shazam for that in a way, isn't there?
Oh.
Is that the same thing?
Right, okay.
Okay. Oh, hang on a second. Oh, look at that. We've got 5 minutes to go.
What are you gonna do?
I'll say 5 minutes out of the tide. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've learnt a lot as well. What do you think? Do you think there's... I've talked to a couple of guests about this, trying to define, for better or for worse, like a New Zealand style. Because for a while there was this sort of Flight of the Conchords, Rhys Darby sort of very deadpan delivery. Do
Yep.
we have a Do we have a... Because we're not... we're not... I was thinking of someone... The other night I was watching Patrice, the black American comedian. For whatever reason, we don't have really bombastic comedians like that.
No.
Is there a style?
Narrative style. We New Zealanders and New Zealand comedians love storytelling.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of storytelling comedians, which travels well.
Yeah.
And we don't have as many liner comedians, as I mentioned before, where there's only been a handful in New Zealand, liner based. And of course, that's quite popular overseas and in the US. In the US, you have to have 3 minutes to get on Letterman and those shows.
Yeah,
3 minutes is ridiculous.
3 minutes is liner territory.
It is.
Because you go bang, 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 bang.
And that's the thing. It's the
Yeah.
Seinfeld approaches to economy of words. You've got to use the least number of words to get the biggest laugh.
Yeah.
And of course, they're raised on that in the States, whereas our comedians tend to tell stories.
Yeah.
And that's noticeable.
Is that more aligned with British style or what? I'm just
it
trying
is.
to look at the
It is more
lineage,
Anglophile.
Yeah.
And not something that isn't big in New Zealand is political comedy.
That's interesting.
Yeah, we most people who sort of launch into a political set, the audience goes, no.
I reckon handled right, you could do it. The other thing I've noticed is we don't. You could prove me wrong because you've seen 98% more of the New Zealand comics than I have. Is we don't have comedians that get quite graphic, kind of sexually and stuff like a lot of US comedians and stuff. We don't have there's a way that can be done that's not offensive. It can actually be not sexually, more around kind of sex and.
Yeah,
gender interaction and that sort of stuff.
You're talking
I'm
about
thinking of Patrice,
who
he pushes the boundaries, but he's very
graphic,
clever
what we
storyteller.
call sort of blue collar comedy.
But I think I don't like to make things class
booty
based.
comedy.
I don't like to make things class based. I think what does blue collar mean? I think Patrice is a brilliant mind.
Yeah,
But anyway, we don't do that, and I wonder whether that was our sort of conservative, sort of British.
It might be. I tell you what. The audiences don't tend to enjoy graphic, obscene comedy. And I just
want to clarify this. I'm not meaning for the sake of it. I'm meaning telling a much bigger story about human interaction and gender interaction. And,
I know what you're talking about. It's subtle. I'll give
you a different example. I'll give you an example now because I'm talking about black comedians. Is because I was just thinking about this now. So let's go sort of being really raw but also quite political. I just thought about this on the spot. We don't have a race-based equivalent of what a lot of the black US comedians do with look at the state of this, look at all of this.
Yeah.
Have you seen someone come through and do
that must be cultural, the difference between America and New Zealand.
That's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, we have struggled to encourage more, for instance, Maori comedians. You'd expect there to be lots in New Zealand. Billy T. James blazed a trail.
Someone told me he was a cabaret performer, not a comedian. I think he was both.
Well, he started out working in the variety clubs as a cabaret performer.
He said stuff and people laughed was my end of my argument to someone with that.
People being classified. I mean, you're right. If you just make people laugh, you're a comedian. It doesn't matter what environment you're in.
Yeah, so go from Maori comedians to, as I said, imagine, I'm saying imagine because it hasn't happened yet. It's interesting. I think it's interesting because it's all obviously hugely cultural as to what audiences...
Also, with the classic, from the outset, we made sure that we were getting balanced audiences. We encouraged and probably tried to satisfy more the female members of the audience before the males.
Yeah.
We didn't want to become like the Sydney Comedy Store, which had turned into a boys' club.
Yeah.
And it was full of hens nights and stag nights. Yeah. And we never wanted that when we opened the Classic. So we always made sure we were taking care of the female members of the audience before the men. And our audiences reflected that, which was we have a lot. Always more than 50% of the room are probably women at the club.
Well, my good friend Dave is a very regular patron of yours, and he goes in with his wife and also his daughter quite often. Now, I don't often have correspondence from the listeners, but I'll just read you this letter here. B. Lovegrove of Ponsonby, it's B. Lovegrove of Ponsonby writes. Tantrums. I've only ever heard him raise his voice 3 times in 23 years, and on each occasion it was directed at me.
That would be right. Brendan and I have a special relationship. And
Brendan's an extraordinary comic.
Yeah, he is. He's the most insightful, natural comedian. After some very hard yards at the beginning, he became extremely good at what he does. And his play with the audience is beautiful. It's world-class, international standard. But because I was there at that very first gig where he wore a dress and lipstick, and so I know what his roots are. And he also knows my roots. And I mean, I knew his older brother. We used to do musicals together.
Wow.
So Brendan and I have known each other for a long, long time.
So these 3 tantrums.
Yeah.
What did you happen? How did you end
I
up losing
can't
it?
remember. One of them was scripted. One of them was a tantrum in the TV series A Night at the Classic, and that was a fantastic tantrum because I had to swear at him, and I don't swear.
Yeah.
And it was scripted in there, and that was a fantastic tantrum. It was probably based on one of the other tantrums. He can be quite frustrating, and but I think the beauty of it is I can say things to Brendan that many other people in the industry probably don't feel they can. So we have that lovely relationship of a lot of things.
Honesty.
Yeah, honesty. There's not much that doesn't go unsaid between us.
Just lastly, and I'll just reiterate again, thank you so much for coming in. It's been a great conversation, and I really look forward to posting it up. I'll try and get it up in the next day or two. Couldn't do this 20 years ago. Just get something and put it somewhere for people.
No.
In the broadcast sense. This is sort of you putting on the spot. You might not have an answer for this, but I just thought, talking about the personality of a comedian, maybe if you could just 4 or 5 words that sum up the stand-up's personality and condition. 5 words.
Fringe dwellers.
It's one, even though it's got a hyphen.
Yeah, it's fringe dwellers. I'm just trying to think how I can qualify that further. On the outside...
It's supposed to be just the words, but go on.
Fringe dwellers, on the outside, looking in.
Yeah.
At the centre that 99% of the world occupy.
I like that.
Constantly observing everyday life and twisting it and turning it into a punchline.
Yeah, that's one. You can get to 5. You can just mention them. You don't have to qualify them.
Yeah. That's so important. That's
Yeah.
what I love about them. And on that, because they're fringe, they're on the fringe of a circle.
Yeah.
You've got left wing side of that circle. You've got the right wing side. So you've also got lots of different viewpoints coming in. And the wonderful thing about a balanced show is having 4 or 5 viewpoints in the show.
Yeah.
So that very important when the people can go away at the end of the night going, I loved 3 of those comedians, not sure about the other 2.
Yeah.
So it's important. Fringe dwellers, observers, very observational, so important.
Yeah. Well, they're commenting on the human condition and life and the absurdity of all, aren't they?
Also, hungry.
3, hungry.
A little bit masochistic. They have to enjoy some pain.
Yeah.
Because there is pain in stand-up comedy.
You've got one left. Use it. Use it wisely. It's like the lamp rub.
Okay. One thing they definitely don't want is a proper job.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think how to phrase that with
You've
one word.
No, you've got to have lack of alternatives.
You could have no other possible options. Hey, just very lastly, is there an actual particular night that is the exact 20th anniversary? Has it happened yet?
It happened this month.
And what did you do for it?
We're having the big night. The whole month is a celebration. We're finishing up with a big party for the old hands and the old staff too, because the staff are really important. So
surely private, not a public thing.
Not a public thing. No, we've got private. So we've basically celebrated with a month of it by having big lineups of our founding comedians who started the place, having those experienced hands coming in hosting Raw. It was October 2nd was the official time we opened the doors. It was a private gig to our friends and things. We actually had an official opening party on October the 10th.
Yeah.
That was back in 1997, and that was a week after we had first opened the doors. And then we just rolled from there. But I now treat the whole month as a celebration because it's good for business.
So you should. Yeah. All right. On your bike, son. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you, Lewis.